This is Mr. MegaManFan, and today I want to talk about Pac-Man for the Atari 2600, a game some people consider to be the worst home conversion of an arcade game of all time, perhaps even the worst home video game of all time. Both points I can see the merits of, but I also think there is a certain amount of bias inherent in those points, and I want to go over why that is and give you the fuller picture of Pac-Man as it exists on this home console, the first ever home console version of the arcade classic. But before we do that, you're looking at the entry on AtariAge.com, which lists it as a Rarity 1 very common cartridge, which is absolutely true. You can find this one at any pawn shop, any thrift store, any flea market, any bookstore. You literally can find a loose copy of Pac-Man for the VCS anywhere. And there's a good reason for that. They made 12 million copies of this game. They made more copies of this game than there were Atari VCS consoles, or as most people know it now, the 2600. They made more games than there were consoles because they assumed people would buy a console just to play this game. And that philosophy worked for Space Invaders. It had never had a home conversion. Theirs was the first, and that genuinely did sell a lot of Atari consoles. But as the 80s progressed, expectations for what home conversions could be started to rise as there were more competitors in the market. There were systems like Intellivision and ColecoVision and Vectrix and a host of others. So everybody thought with that level of competition, the level of quality would increase. And that's where we get into the debate about whether or not Pac-Man is a good game on the 2600. Now, let's start with the fact that the ghosts are flickering, because that is the singular thing everybody focuses on. Todd Frye had 4K of space to work with to write all of the code for this game. If you know anything about computer programming, 4096 bytes is not a lot to work with. And in the 6 months that he had and the 4K that he had available, he couldn't faithfully reproduce the ghosts with the limitations of the 2600 as they were understood at the time. People found clever ways around it as time went on, but not all of those clever ways were known to the programmers until they were discovered. So he worked within the limitations of what he had, and the flickering ghost monsters that are all the same color is the result, which is going to drive Pac-Man fans. A lot of them just are absolutely going to go batshit about that, because you expect Inky, Blinky, Pinky, and Clyde, but you've got 4 Pinkies that don't even stay solid on the screen. Then there's the misshapen dots, which there's no two ways around it. They look like Morse code on the screen. It's like dash, 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 dot, dot, dash, dash, dash. This is also a programming limitation when it comes to the 2600. The display is being mirrored from one side to the other, which is why you get an oversized dot right in the middle. And I don't know that the way this was programmed, it could have been done any different. We're talking about the downsides, so let me hear. I'll just add another one here. Pac-Man doesn't really look much like Pac-Man in the arcade. He's not even opening and closing his mouth the way you would expect Pac-Man to. It's not fluid. He's not facing up when he turns up or down when he turns down. He can only face left or right no matter what way he's moving. He goes through the tunnel really, really slowly, and the tunnel itself is in the middle instead of being to the left or the right side. There are so many reasons that when you compare this to actual arcade Pac-Man, you're not going to be able to stand it. But now, to give you a different side of the scenario here. As a home conversion of Pac-Man, it doesn't look right, sound right. It doesn't play like Pac-Man, but it's not necessarily a bad game. It's just not a good Pac-Man game. If they had not called it Pac-Man and had just called it Maze Munch or something, and just did it as a derivative knockoff of a maze game like Pac-Man, then people might have actually been able to accept it, because there were certainly no shortage of Pac-Man clones for home computers and video game consoles at the time. Some that got sued out of existence, some that didn't. This concept was widely copied, though, and if you look at it as a copy of a concept and not an actual Pac-Man game, then as a maze munching game, it's not really the worst thing in the world. It's fun when you don't think of it as being Pac-Man, because you can get into a groove when you're playing this where you can easily clear all the enemies on the screen and get all the dots and get into a rhythm of avoiding the ghost monsters, or whatever you would like to call them, and you can enjoy the challenge. When I was really young and I didn't have anything other than a Commodore VIC-20, which wasn't strictly mine, I had to share it with my whole family, I didn't have any opportunity to play home video games other than what I could type in or load off a cassette tape. And the VIC-20 in its own way had as many limitations, perhaps in some ways more, than a home console like the 2600 or the ColecoVision. So for me, whenever I got to play this on somebody's Atari, or got to play it on a Sears demo station in a Sears store, because Sears had their own branded line of VCS Atari consoles, to me, I was never going, this isn't Pac-Man, I'm pissed off, this isn't anything like what I want. I was always like, yeah, I'm playing a video game. I don't get to do this all the time. This is fun. I'm playing video games. Like, you didn't have to worry about where you would find me in the Sears store. Like, if mom wanted to go look at clothes, if dad wanted to go look at hardware and tools, like, just put me by the television they have the Sears arcade console hooked up to. I'd be standing there playing Pac-Man. And if somebody else was playing, I'd wait until they were done, and I'd be playing Pac-Man. Call it whatever you want. You don't have to call it Pac-Man. It's sold as Pac-Man, and that's their fault. They wanted to port Pac-Man to the VCS. They paid for the license to do that, and with a 6-month and a 4K limitation, Todd Frye created the best he could with the limitations that he was given. It was not going to be as quality as the Namco arcade. And it's not to say that the VCS isn't capable of coming a lot closer, because by the time Ms. Pac-Man was released, they had figured out more of the tricks and were using bigger ROM sizes so they could put more data into a cartridge. It can be done. So, play this game with some perspective.